Hey everybody, it's your friend and your guy and your favorite thick boy, Gardiner, the Linux gamer. He might have been talking about the phone though. This video is brought to you as always by my gracious Patreon contributors, including the support of my top tier Singularity members. I want to give a special shout out to NQBW. NQBW, my dude, I greatly appreciate your support. All right, we're just about over with 2019, and I've seen a lot of people on Twitter complaining about the year and how grateful they are that the year is over. You know what? 2019 has been an awesome year. I don't like the whole complainy business. I'm not into it. But more importantly than 2019 being over, the 2010s are over. The whole decade has just flown by, hasn't it? It's been insane how fast it's gone by. So I wanted to counteract all the complainy people and talk about some of the cool and weird things that have happened in the Linux world this decade. So here are my top 10 picks for things that happened in the open source world. Number 10, acquisitions. This is a weird one. We were all kind of shocked when IBM bought Red Hat, weren't we? I mean, I asked Twitter what some of the most influential, consequential things to happen in the Linux world this decade was, and that was one of the most common responses that I got was IBM buying Red Hat. And you know, it was a shocking moment, but when I think back on it, there have been a couple big acquisitions in the open source world in the last decade. SUSE was bought twice and had 3 different corporate parents, which is bananas to me. Microsoft made some huge plays, including buying Citrus Data, which is the owner of PostgreSQL. And then they also bought GitHub. And everyone out there, you don't have to tell me that GitHub isn't open source, but it's where a lot of open source development happens. It's where a lot of open source projects live. It's where they call home. So the fact that Microsoft has the platform upon which much of the open source world is built, well, that's kind of a big deal, isn't it, boys? Microsoft also bought Nokia, and they were the people that made Symbian OS, which was an open source operating system before the whole smartphone thing happened. And they bought like all of the keynote speeches at like half of the Linux conventions in the world. So good on you, Microsoft. They also bought like some closed source software, but that affects Linux in some way, like Skype, for example. They also bought Mojang, which means that they own Minecraft now. Microsoft has made some big plays, and a lot of their acquisitions have direct impact on our community. The fact that they took Skype and turned it into a centralized service, what was a peer-to-peer communication service is now this centralized service. You know, that's kind of insane. And you know, there were a lot of people who asked me to talk about the fact that Microsoft has this changing attitude towards Linux and open source software. Really, what can you do? Microsoft says that they love the open source community, and they are doing things where they're like buying up companies that make open source software. And you can't take what they say at face value. You have to look at what they do, because what they do is what they're actually doing. You know, like, they can say whatever they want. What they actually do is what we should judge them by. So far, it doesn't seem like there has been much of a corporate culture change as far as I've seen. And the fact that they're buying up all these open source companies, we'll have to wait and see. We'll have to see what these acquisitions actually mean for open source. But you know, I am very interested to see where we go from here. Number 9, hardware compatibility. Boy, oh boy, is this a big one. Wow, there has been a lot of work done in this area, particularly in the last decade. Back in 2010, I was having issues with audio hardware, with network hardware. Do you guys remember having to use the NDIS wrapper to be able to actually use your Wi-Fi card in your computer? Whoa, dude, we've come a long way. But you know, I even had trouble with like USB controllers and extraneous speakers. I mean, I had trouble with a lot of different hardware. And we can attribute some of the alleviation of these pain points to hardware manufacturers who have stepped up their game and contributed drivers to the Linux kernel. Not all of them are open source, but we are moving in a direction that I think is good for everyone. But we also have to thank kernel developers who have done their part to make sure that all of these things work together with the Linux kernel. In Linux, you have most of the drivers for most of the hardware that you're ever going to use included in the kernel. So when you put in, I was about to say disk, that's how old I am. When you put in the USB stick to launch the system, all of the drivers for all of the system hardware that you have are included. And they're all really small. I mean, it's very, very small to have all these drivers included. In Windows, you have to go online, download all the drivers that include like hundreds of megabytes of bloatware in order to get your system up and running to a usable state, even in most cases. In Linux, most of the time, it just works, dude. That's one of the things that I love so much about Linux. Do you guys remember having to use FGLRX Radeon Catalyst drivers? Boy, oh boy, do I remember that. That was an awful, awful, awful time. We're at a stage now where in a lot of cases, you can use the open source drivers that come with the Linux kernel to play games. I have a Vega 64 in this PC right here. You can see it spinning right there. And holy cow, I'd never have to do hardly anything to get this thing working. It works out of the box with no issues. We are at a point now where you can play video games on Linux, high-end AAA video games with the highest graphics settings, and you don't have to install drivers because the open source drivers that are included in the kernel are just that good. That makes me so happy. If you had asked me at the beginning of this decade what was going to happen, what was going to be some of the big changes, I would not have guessed that hardware support would have advanced to this point. So impressive. Great job, guys. Number 8, devices. Linux is everywhere. It powers the entire digital world. If you have a little device and it's digital, there's a good chance that it's got Linux running on it. From Tesla's vehicles to the entire internet, the even International Space Station, even your set-top cable box. I mean, all of these things are running Linux. It powers the entire world, guys. Technically, Android is Linux. Android, the operating system on most people's smartphones, is Linux. Now, I have some issues with the way that it's implemented here. It's not the same Linux that you would get on a desktop computer, but it's technically the Linux kernel, and that's pretty cool. And it's the dominant operating system for smartphones. I mean, come on. And let's not forget about Chromebooks. I mean, I think Chromebooks are more Linuxy than Android, and they are being sold at Best Buy right next to Windows-powered laptops. I didn't expect that to happen in this decade, and that's nothing to shake a stick at. I mean, you can install deb packages on a Chromebook. That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. And I hesitate to mention the Librem 5 because I don't want to twist the panties of the anti-purism hate machine. No, I actually don't give a crap about pissing them off. We have more choices at the end of 2019 in terms of like actual Linux hardware in your pocket than we ever have. And I think that that's great. There are a lot of people who are super, super excited for the Pine phone. There are people who are really excited for Fairphone and all the other Linux-y phones that are out there. There's so much more choice now than there ever has been in the Linux device market. And that makes me really, really happy. Number 7, and we have to talk about this, vulnerabilities. The vulnerabilities that have occurred this decade have really kind of shattered at least my naive expectations that free and open source software are always more secure than proprietary offerings. That is definitely not the case. Now, by its nature and by the way that it's developed, free and open source software generally is more secure than closed source offerings, but that's only if it's actively developed by a team of engineers. Remember Heartbleed when OpenSSL was like catastrophically exposed? I mean, it was like leaking memory to anyone who knew how to use the exploit. Pretty catastrophic, pretty bad stuff. And it was because there was literally just one dude working on OpenSSL. Nobody else was working on it. And when you have this major project that most of the internet relies on, and yet it ends up not being maintained properly, and it's only developed by one dude, and it's like a couple million lines of code, well, of course you're going to have vulnerabilities. How about Shell Shock or Poodle or Spectre or Meltdown? Now, Spectre and Meltdown, they were both hardware vulnerabilities. I fully recognize that, but it did give us a very, very interesting look into how disclosure works in the open source world. I mean, how the kernel team developed mitigation routines for Spectre and Meltdown in private without revealing it, so that bad actors could use that information before the patches were ready. That was interesting, to say the least. I was following that very closely. I don't know if you guys were. The fact is, free and open source software is only as secure as our cooperation and our vigilance. And I think that's something we should remember going into the 2020s. Number 6, Ubuntu and its derivatives. I believe that in the last decade, there was no distribution as important or as influential as Ubuntu. Now, some people will get upset about this, and others will hurl insults in the comments below. Go for it. Your outrage feeds the algorithm. But listen, I really believe this. In 2010, Ubuntu took a brand new approach. They launched Unity, and it was a divisive experience, to say the least. Ironically, Unity kind of splintered its user base, and a lot of people went from using Ubuntu to other distributions. That was big news for a lot of distributions. I remember jumping from Ubuntu to Linux Mint, from Linux Mint to Fedora, from Fedora to OpenSUSE, and then back to Ubuntu. Unity developed and matured to a point where, it still has a cult following to this day, and a lot of people got on board with Unity after it hit feature parity with GNOME 2. And there are still a bunch of really awesome things that Unity did that I kind of wish GNOME would do, like being able to hit the Alt key and search through menus. Dude, that was one of the killer features of Unity. I loved that. And Ubuntu is actually used as the upstream for many distributions, and some of them were started in the 2010s. I mean, you have Bodhi Linux and Elementary and Pop! OS. These distributions all use Ubuntu as their base, and they also have a focus on user experience. And I think that's the last reason that Ubuntu was the most important and influential, is because Ubuntu has, since its inception, been focused almost exclusively on making sure that their desktop experience was on par with and competitive with Windows. Ubuntu in the 2010s was the Linux on-ramp for so many new users. It was the place that so many people started using Linux, and I believe that much of the growth of Linux over the last 10 years can be in large part attributed to Ubuntu's focus on ease of use and the user experience. Now, with Ubuntu putting more of its focus behind Ubuntu server, I am really interested to see who's going to take up the mantle of a user-focused Linux distro. I have my suspicions. I think it might be Manjaro, and Manjaro is great, and they just incorporated. I have a bunch of stuff to say about Manjaro, but we'll see where it goes from here. Number 5, GNOME 3. Now, it had a controversial launch when it hit in the 2010s. There were so many people, including myself, who hated GNOME 3 compared to GNOME 2. GNOME 3 was different, and different means scary, right? Plus, it was really, really slow on my then laptop. And you got to remember, like I said, I mean, back then when GNOME 3 launched, many of us had to move away from Ubuntu because of Unity, and GNOME 3 was the default on Fedora and a couple other distros, and I couldn't stand it when it first launched. I really did not like it. I ended up with Ubuntu using XFCE, and that had a lot of problems of its own. It had a lot of the features I wanted from a desktop environment, but I really felt pretty homeless at that point. I mean, there were things that I had come to expect with GNOME 3 that the features that were just missing from XFCE. A year of hopping distros between different desktop environments. I was using KDE, I was using XFCE. I tried Unity. I couldn't use any of them. None of them ever felt like I was truly home. None of them felt like my workflow. And then I tried GNOME 3 about a year after it had launched, and that's when I fell in love. I mean, I felt like I came home at that point. Everything worked the way I wanted it to. Everything worked the way I expected it to. And I found that I didn't need to tweak hardly anything. That was so great. That was such a revelatory moment for me. It was like 2011 or 2012 maybe. And I was like, diggity dang, I like this. This is my home right here. This is where I belong. And every release of GNOME since then has been on point. There have been a couple questionable moments here and there, like when they removed the ability to launch executables in Nautilus, but they reversed that. And they're working on making GNOME the best desktop environment that is available right now. And it really is. And I want to say thank you to the GNOME developers. You guys are freaking great. Number 4, the proliferation of open source. Now, back in the 90s and the early 2000s, much of the world was dominated by proprietary offerings. I mean, you had DirectX, which was the default, right? You had Microsoft offering all of their proprietary crap. Slowly, we are moving towards an open source world. That is good. If it's Vulkan, if it's HTML5, if it's Blender, all of these things are taking market share from proprietary software, and that's fundamentally a good thing. It makes for a more open and level playing field. Remember back to a time when you had to install Flash to actually use half of the internet. I mean, YouTube. Remember YouTube when you had to use freaking Flash to play videos? Do you remember back when you had to install Silverlight through Wine and do this weird plugin thing in Firefox in order to actually use Netflix? Say what you will about EME in HTML5, but you have to admit that it has made a lot of the web easier to use and the barrier to entry on Linux that much lower. It's not just EME though. I mean, HTML and JavaScript have matured to a point where many of the applications that would have had to be native are now implemented in your browser, which means that no matter what operating system you're on, you have access to the apps and services that you are used to. Stuff like Microsoft Office and Discord and many, many others, they're all available on Linux. And that's a huge deal because Office 365 is reaching a point where that's what Microsoft is going to be focusing on. They're not going to be doing the native clients for Office in like 4 years. I'm predicting that in like 2023, Microsoft's just going to do away with the native clients for Microsoft Office products, and it's all going to move to Office 365. What does that mean for Linux? It means that we actually have Office, and that's one more thing that's removed from the list of reasons why people don't use Linux. Now, say what you will about the cloud, but that's a big deal. And it's all because of HTML5 and JavaScript reaching a maturity where these apps are actually possible inside a web browser. And as WebAssembly reaches maturity, we're going to see apps like Adobe's Creative Suite coming to the web browser, meaning that they will be available on the Linux desktop. I predict that in a couple of years, that's actually something that's going to happen. And this isn't just about web technology. This is also about native technologies like Vulkan. Vulkan is an open source alternative to DirectX, and it is more performant and more spectacular than anything DirectX can do. It's a portable cross-platform coding language for your graphics card, and it lets developers just code their graphics language once. It's really powerful because when you bring over a Vulkan game into Wine or Proton, it doesn't have to actually be transpiled into OpenGL or whatever. Whatever the language is on Windows, it also works exactly the same way natively in Linux. And so there's none of that delay, none of that problem that crops up when you have to translate DirectX calls into OpenGL. That's really important. Additionally, the fact that we have open source drivers for AMD cards and Intel cards, and you can use them to play a lot of games out of the box on Linux, that's fantastic as well. And let's not forget about RISC-V, which is something Wendell reminded me of. Thank you, Wendell. RISC-V is an open hardware architecture that many predict to supplant the Intel x86-based processors. Open source all the way. I mean, I can't wait to see where this goes. Number 3, Linuxy content creators. When the decade started, I was watching Jupiter Broadcasting, and I was watching it through RSS feeds. Wow, long time ago. Really, they were the only high-quality content on offer that catered to my tastes. I mean, sure, Twit was around, I think, at that point, but they weren't exclusively about like open source and cool technology stuff like that. The Linux Action Show was one of my favorite shows. If you had asked me what my favorite show was, I would have said Linux Action Show. As the years marched on, other Linux content creators popped up. Jordan Keyes, do you remember This Week in Linux? That was one of the shows that actually inspired me to start this channel. And then Wendell showed up on the scene, and I became a huge fan of Wendell and his group. And now there are too many podcasts and channels and live streamers and blogs to mention for fear of leaving one out. Our cup runneth over. I mean, we're even regularly covered in Forbes magazine. Thank you, Jason. You're awesome, man. There is infinite potential for Linux content creators, and I believe that us creators are helping to move the community forward, getting the message out there and letting people know that Linux is a viable option. So if you want to start a channel, just do it. Just do it. Number 2, Steam for Linux. I remember back when Valve first announced Steam for Linux. I had been playing my Humble Bundle games for years. At that point, I had just moved back to GNOME 3, and I had heard so much speculation that that Valve was going to bring Steam to the Linux desktop. Now, my brothers had been using Steam for years at that point, and they had been raving about it, especially about the Steam sales. And this was back when Reddit had nothing but nice things to say about Valve, too. I mean, that was how long ago this was. So I was curious, and when it actually launched, man, I jumped on board so hard, and I realized that I could actually redeem all of my Humble Bundle games into my Steam account. Yeah, that's when I really sat up and took notice of Steam. Steam for Linux, I felt, was kind of a watershed moment for the Linux desktop. It tore down one of the biggest, most, what seemed like insurmountable walls that stood between PC gamers and the Linux desktop. The fact that Steam now ran natively on Linux, and about a quarter of your games could actually be played on Linux natively, well, that was a game changer, pun intended. It meant that you wouldn't completely lose access to your Steam library if you made the switch. Now, there were still some major hurdles to be cleared for PC gamers on Linux, but it was a great first step and something that Valve would address in years to come. Number 1, ease of use. The 2010s were a decade where the FOSS community took the end user's experience seriously. We spent so much time and energy focusing on polishing the desktop experience and making sure that we cleared the roadblocks that prevented people from picking up and using Linux at the outset. And I've already mentioned a few of these things. I mean, Ubuntu and Vulkan and open source drivers, HTML5, all of these things that have really paved the way for greater Linux adoption. But there are a few things that I haven't mentioned yet. One of them is Lutris. Lutris has really made waves. Lutris is a front end that helps you manage the headache of getting your Windows games running on Linux. Lutris is so impactful that Epic Games has given them $50,000 in 2019 alone. I'm pretty sure it's $50,000. It might be more than that. $50,000 to actively develop this application. It helps you install multiple game launchers. It helps you manage games that don't have support on Steam or on Epic Game Store or anything like that. It also works as a front end for your emulators. Lutris truly is an awesome piece of software, and I can't wait to see where it goes in the 2020s. And finally, I want to mention Proton. I think Proton is one of the most consequential pieces of software that has come out of Valve ever. It's not new technology. I mean, it's literally wine that has been packaged inside of Steam. But that's kind of why it's so important. Steam is the de facto standard for PC gaming. And most PC gamers have thousands of dollars invested in Steam. The problem that Steam for Linux faced was simple. Valve had Steam Play. Steam Play meant that if you owned a game on Windows, you owned the game on other platforms too. And basically that left there almost no incentive for game developers to actually port their games to Linux, because potentially all that work would be given away for free. That's a questionable business model for most people, and that's one of the reasons that Steam for Linux had such trouble early on. Proton basically lets you run a lot of your Windows-only library on Linux inside the native Steam for Linux client. That's consequential because before that, you had to have two instances of Steam running, the Windows version running through Wine and the Linux the native Linux client running natively. It was a cluster F. It was awful. And the fact that Valve addressed that shows that they really do care about Linux as a gaming platform, as a future for gaming in general. And I think that Proton is at a point where if games are optimized well, they're just going to run well inside of Proton. And I don't necessarily think that we need to have native Linux clients, because what we've seen with Steam for Linux is that a lot of the native Linux clients get neglected at a certain point. They don't get updates as much as the Windows version does. And so for Valve to be able to create this compatibility layer, to include this compatibility layer in Steam, it makes for a much easier experience and a much easier transition from Windows to Linux. So that's my list. I would love to know what you guys think about this. Let me know in the comments below. This has been a lot of fun to make this list, to go back and look at some of the biggest headlines, some of the biggest news stories of the decade. I'm growing a bit wistful. I've been doing this channel for 5 years at this point, half a decade. And, I wouldn't be able to do it if it wasn't for you guys. And I'm not just talking about my patrons whose support means everything to me, but I'm talking about your viewership. If it wasn't for you guys watching, I wouldn't be doing this. It means so much that you guys are out there and that you care about what I have to say and that you tune into my videos. It's so awesome. I don't know where I would be in my life if I didn't have this channel, honestly. And so I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for your support. Thank you for the kind things that you say. Thank you for reaching out to me when I haven't been super active on social media. I really appreciate it. I've met so many awesome people doing this, and so many of you guys I've met are just amazing, and I just wanted to say thank you. Here's to an awesome 2020. I'm not crying, you're crying. I think that's going to do it for this video, guys. If you believe in the work that I do, you can support the show on Patreon. You can pick up a t-shirt. There's a link in the description. But no matter what you do, whether you hit that like button or share this video with your friends, don't forget to subscribe to see more from me, the Linux Gamer. Happy New Year, and I'll see you next time.